welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion. Let me introduce you today's panelists. You already had the pleasure to meet Mr. William Dalrymple, who is a best-selling author, broadcaster, and one of Britain's most renowned historians. To his right, there's Dr. David Hodge, professor at the School of Social Work at Arizona State University, and also visiting fellow at MCC. Then to his right, there's Tibor Fischer, award-winning novelist, writer, and head of the Center for Literature at MCC. Thank you for joining us. So I think we should start off with the hard hitters. Have you thought about before what your purpose is, or do you think that you even have one?
Who first?
You can go.
Oh, God. I mean, this is, of course, one of the great questions, and every religious thinker in all traditions, every philosopher, Heidegger, Nietzsche, Camus, have written about this. And I have to say, I'm completely unqualified to answer it. I'm not a philosopher. I've never thought about that. But that in itself is an interesting exercise. And I'm grateful in the sense for having been given a week to kind of pull my thoughts together on this. Because it's not something that, in general, we all live our lives from day to day. And particularly when you're young and you're starting a career and you just have to make do, or if you're a peasant working in the fields, a farmer, and just making your daily life. These are not daily things that you have time to think about. But I think this is addressed at university students, and of course this is the great time in your life when you can consider these questions and think where you stand on them. I mean, Camus was very interesting. Camus, I'll just read to you. Camus regarded this question that you've sent me as the great question of humanity. He says, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the world has 9 or 12 categories, all this comes afterwards. These are games. One must first answer this.
Yes, I think mortality is one of the greatest factors when we think about our purpose here in life. Do you think that, what other factors play a role in that? Maybe our education, the history of the nation you were born in, Tibor?
Well, can everyone hear me? Okay, yes? First of all, if there is anyone in the crowd who has an answer, please shout it out, because we don't really know. I think what William sort of left out from the start of the famous essay by Albert Camus, The Myth of Sisyphus, is that although that sounds rather grim, actually at the end of that essay, Camus finishes off by saying, although Sisyphus was this mythical character who had to roll a rock up a hill all day and then watch the rock roll back down and start again the following day, his message was that you have to think of Sisyphus as happy. And strictly speaking, I mean, for a long time I actually thought that the purpose of life really was about people largely going out and buying all the books written by Tibor Fischer in several languages, but I'm not so sure about that now. And in one very basic sense, the purpose of life is life. It's to carry on with life and to create life further down the road. What we're, I think, being invited to sort of speculate on is more, in the Monty Python sense, the meaning of life, the significance of life. And essentially, having thought a little bit about it, I think there are probably 3 camps here. One is religion, which obviously provides, a very detailed explanation of what the purpose of life is. Then you have the philosophers who from sort of Nietzsche on, try to deal with the idea of a universe without God and how you make sense of things. You have, Sartre with existentialism, which Camus rejected probably because Sartre thought up the idea and he felt it was wrong. The difference, I suppose, really between existentialism and Camus' absurdism is that existentialists claim there is a sort of meaning that you can create for yourself, whereas Camus insisted there is no meaning, you have to accept there is no meaning, you have to accept the absurdity, although in a sense that comes back in a way to what Sartre was saying in the first place. Then you have, as William pointed out, perhaps a lot of people who don't think about it, because one of the things about philosophy and speculation is you do have to have time to think about it, or possibly not care about it.
One answer you haven't given, as well as the three kinds, there's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which, what is it, 48? What's the...
42.
42.
42, yeah.
After four volumes,
the obvious answer,
the answer is revealed.
Yeah, Tibor, it's actually great that you mention religion, because I think, for me, one of the main draws of religion is to give a purpose to our life, to have something to look forward to. What do you think, David?
So it's interesting that I'm up here paired with two writers. So I'm an academic, and I've spent 20 years researching the relationship between spirituality and religion, and wellness, human flourishing, on the other hand. And I totally agree that the stories that we tell about ourselves, about the world around us, about metaphysical reality, are critically important. So spiritual stories, religious stories, what we found is that people that are more devout in terms of their spirituality, their relationship with God or ultimate transcendence, they tend to do better on a whole host of psychological and physical health outcomes. And one of those health outcomes is purpose and meaning in life. So my two esteemed colleagues here have talked about Camus and how he doesn't really provide a very sort of satisfactory outlook on life and purpose, at least according to many individuals. So you contrast that with the stories that are provided by religious perspectives, and that's a very different perspective. It's much more hopeful, it's much more optimistic. So just take, for instance, the issue of dealing with trials. So life is difficult for almost everybody. We all face many challenges. But what does someone like Camus offer us when we face difficulties or trials? So you compare that with what, for example, Christianity and other faith traditions, they would say that there's a transcendent God that can actually use those trials to bring beneficial effects to your life, either in this present reality or in the future reality to come. And that's a very hopeful message for many people. It gives people a sense of purpose and meaning. Now, not for everybody, but definitely for a lot of people.
Yeah, thank you. Do you think that we are actually the ones who decide our purpose, or is it, I don't know, maybe social media, maybe other outside factors like how we've been brought up by our parents?
Or literature even. As a writer, I feel I should mention the fact that a great deal of literature, the canon, is really about this subject of trying to make sense of things. And it has to be said that there aren't really very clear answers to be found in literature. And indeed, two of the great classics of literature, Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert and Don Quixote by Cervantes, are actually about the bad influence literature can have on people's lives by giving them sort of unrealistic expectations. And even the more sort of thoughtful writers, someone like Dostoevsky, having read Dostoevsky, most of his stuff several times, I still can't really work out what his position is, apart from being very dissatisfied and angry with a lot of things. Jane Austen, I mean, one of the sort of most memorable things I read in Jane Austen, whom I consider to be one of the greatest British novelists, there's a line in her novel Persuasion about a very minor character who the protagonist goes to see, and whose name I've now forgotten. But she goes to see this friend, and she describes her as having a very cheerful nature. And Austen comments, "This is the best thing you can have in life, is a cheerful nature."
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that the sociological evidence is pretty clear that our demographic backgrounds, the culture we're raised in, the society that we're raised in, that definitely influences our understanding and perceptions of meaning and purpose in life. So all that's true on one hand, but on the other hand, as the existential therapists have pointed out, people have the ability to choose. And so people can make a choice that brings meaning to their lives.
Yeah, well, this goes back to Pascal's famous bet, the wager, that you might as well believe in God because if you're wrong, you don't really lose out, which I always imagine God would be rather angry with Pascal for that argument. It's not a very convincing sales pitch, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about how much our lives are formed by our cultures that we're surrounded with, and maybe I should supplement what you've said very interestingly about Christianity by talking about, I live in India, and there you have not one religious tradition or even a dominant religious tradition. You have these multiple faith systems, often of enormous complexity, profundity, and subtlety. And even within individual religions like Hinduism or Islam, there are divergent ways. And if you would like, I've got three little cameos from three different religions, just to give an example of the wide-ranging answers to this problem that one culture has come up with. So in mainstream Hindu culture, you are taught that there are three goals in life. Artha, Kama, and Dharma. Artha basically means making a living, being successful in your daily life, making a career for yourself. So if you're a university student, getting out, getting a job, getting on with the daily business of life in a successful way. Kama means, as the Kama Sutra suggests, sexual pleasure, love, bodily love. So it's the only world religion which actually puts sexual pleasure as an aim of life, which many would argue is missing in Christianity, which has always been suspicion of the body and regards Eden and the fall as and is complicated about sexuality. Hinduism puts sexuality right there as one of the goals, basic goals of life. And the third thing is dharma, which is a difficult word to translate. It's a central word at the heart of a lot of Indian philosophy, and it doesn't have a direct English equivalent. But people normally opt for duty as the nearest equivalent. And it means duty to country, duty to family, the things you have to do in life to live a moral life. So that's, in a sense, the orthodox Hindu view. Buddhism, of course, rejects that, and in a very interesting way. And I'm just going to read from, I've just been writing about Buddhism, so I've handily got on my phone a very quick idea of what the Buddhist answer to this. Buddhism, like some strands of Christianity, in a sense, some mystical Christian strands, believes that the material world is basically an illusion. The Buddha said it was like a dream from which everyone must waken sooner or later. Material pleasures, he said, are like a man who dreams of a fine house with fine gardens and sumptuous delights. Yet when he awakens, all of it vanishes. Distinctions of wealth and poverty, noble and common, are like a dream. The Buddha also taught the solution to this problem, the dharma, or moral path, to the cessation of both desire and suffering. The doctrine of the Buddha was at once a philosophy to live by and a method, a practical spiritual path of mental training and discipline that he assured his followers would free them from the pain inherent in existence. And this is the idea at the heart of Buddhism, that existence involves pain. But there are ways to escape pain, and you escape pain by removing desire, and if you escape desire, you don't suffer. His message focused on love, compassion, detachment, non-violence, as well as intense meditation and self-discovery. Following this path, he said, others could follow him in breaking free from what he regarded as the cycles of rebirth and the bonds of samsara, so becoming enlightened. In this way, they could obtain nirvana, which means simply a flame blown out by the wind. Very beautiful, but it's not a philosophy that appeals to me because it's too dark, I think. I don't think life is just suffering. But anyway, it's an interesting one.
You love your material pleasure too much.
I like my material pleasures too much. It's true. I'm not a good Buddhist. And then finally, another interesting, and final, I'll just talk for a second about Sufi Islam. Islam is, like Christianity, has many different strands and many different forms. But the most attractive I've always found is the mystical form of Islam, Sufism, which, for example, Jalaluddin Rumi and so on are examples. And just again, a quick paragraph on that. There are many different schools of Sufism, so it's hard to generalize. But some of the most extended images or metaphors in Sufi poetry, all the way from Hafez to Rumi, are that of the moth and the candle, which is also something one finds, of course, in classical authors. The candle signifying God's light, nur, while the moth signifies mortal life or human desire, which is to be one with God, to be the one with supreme and not separated, and to eliminate separation, which is expressed as a longing becoming immersed in the power of the one. Death is figured as the desired annihilation of the self, the letting go of self, and letting go all that individuates and marks the separation of the person or self from God. So the struggle or the purpose of life is to rise from the self and strive towards the God. That's just 3 glimpses of 2 totally different traditions, all of which give completely different answers to this problem, but within just one country. So I think, in a sense, one of the lessons is that there is no one answer to this. One has got to find one's individual path that works for the individual.
Would you like to add something, David, to the religious aspects? Or?
Yeah, that's, as you read that, a thought popped into my mind, and I think that all the major religions deal with suffering in one way or another. Like, they acknowledge that life is not always easy, whereas I don't know that the secularist worldview really has an answer for suffering, whereas religion does. So it's an interesting point that you made about including even Buddhism, which is non-theistic.
Buddhism has different forms. I mean, again, you could find Mahayana Buddhism probably would regard itself as theistic.
Good point. Thank you.
As you know, gentlemen, MCC is a talent management institute. You know, we are focused on the youth. What do you think? Would you have anything to add to a young 20-year-old university student who is struggling to find his purpose? What do you think that his or her purpose should be?
Well, as someone who's studied the classics, I would say that the most profound piece of advice I can think of from the ancient Greeks, who thought a lot about stuff and saw a lot of stuff. It's the thing at the oracle at Delphi, know yourself. This is a very difficult thing to achieve. It takes a long time, and you'll probably make mistakes and wander off in the wrong direction. But this is, I think, one of the most useful things in life. If you can actually know yourself and understand yourself, what really interests you, what really motivates you, what are your limits, then you can do quite well for yourself. But it's a tricky business to achieve.
Yeah, that's great advice. So I just want to echo that and then add on to it. So the popular culture would just tell you to engage in self-indulgence a lot of times. Just get that quick hit that comes from social media or some other sort of instantaneous sort of gratification. So I would try to resist that lure as much as possible and try to think about some of these deeper questions in life that you've kind of alluded to, Tibor. So where do I want to go with my life? What do I want my life to look like at the end of it? I heard one person say that you should make every major life decision in a graveyard, realizing that at some point in time, that's where you're going to be too. And so what do I want my life to be about during the 80 years that I have?
I think I would agree very much with that. And I think it's very important, if you're at university age, to dream, because your life is in front of you. You have all the options. And just one practical piece, to take it from high philosophy and high religion, just to a practical thing, just do something in life that makes you want to get up in the morning. You know, we all have many options of various lives we can follow. But to have something that gives you pleasure, whatever your interests are, to wake up in the morning and do the thing that you love is and just on a day-to-day basis, one of the most important things in life, because most of your life is spent working. You know, you have families, you have relationships, there are many other things to life, but ultimately, you know, 12 hours of your day is likely to be spent, or 10 hours of your day, at your work. And so to get up in the morning and do something you love, rather than something you rather hate or are completely neutral about, is one of the great gifts. And it's in a sense, it's a very obvious thing, but it's also, it's terribly important, I think. To, you know, the pleasure, Tibor, I'm sure, feels the same. You know, there are many awful things about writing and sitting looking at a blank sheet of paper, but when it works, and the pleasure to look back, particularly when something is finished, on a pile of manuscript.
A great relief, yes.
And you know, that pleasure is terrific. My wife is an artist, and you know, again, many struggles with and moments when no ideas come and so on. But to do something you love is a terrific addition to life. And if you do something that you hate as your daily life, your life will be ultimately hugely diminished. It's a dream.
And you might as well aim high as well.
Yeah, but how would you, or how can you balance this? You know, you said that do something that you enjoy, and you, David, also mentioned self-indulgence. But as we have talked about it before, there are many outside factors to this as well, because you do not only work for yourself or for your own pleasure, but you know, to take care of your family. You may be doing at this moment something that you do not enjoy that much, but you can have in the back of your mind the thought that, you know, if I wake up now and do something that makes me uncomfortable at this second, it will maybe put me a bit closer to what I want to do in the future. So how can you balance this?
The danger, of course, is that you end up doing that thing and never get round to doing the thing you love. Right. And I often find that people who do the thing they love, even though it may not at first look like a lucrative career, it's not joining Goldman Sachs, it's not becoming a consultant at some big bank or something, but you do best what you love most.
Well, for some people, it's actually joining Goldman Sachs, of course, so, you know yourself.
So David, or William, sorry, can we talk a bit more about the cultural differences in the purpose? Could you maybe draw some more parallels in, you know, what an average Indian person, which is hard to say, someone is average in India, how would his or her idea of the sense of purpose would compare to maybe ours?
Well, as I say, it's a very difficult question to answer, because India is really a continent, and a vast continent, full of, I mean, and that's the great pleasure in the sense of living there, is it is so unknowable. I've been living there 35 years now, and every year I discover some new religious tradition, some extraordinary school of art, some amazing empire that covered hundreds of miles that I've simply never heard of before. And it is the vastness of that and the diversity of that. And I think, in a sense, that diversity is India's greatest lesson, is that, you know, we come from a continent where there's basically been one major religious tradition for 2,000 years, or 1,500 years, certainly. But that is an exception. The fact that Europe has had that one tradition, which is so deeply embedded, and, you know, and all the pre-existing pagan beliefs were wiped out by about the 11th century. That Europe is the exception in that way, and India, in a sense, is much more the norm in that there have been so many different paths to follow, each with its own adherence, each with its own passionate belief in its own veracity. And that, to me, I mean, I grew up in a very, I suppose you'd call it almost fundamentalist Catholic household. I had an uncle who was a priest, my brother became a priest. I was sent to a school which was run by monks. And I was deeply immersed and very moved by the religious tradition I was brought up in. But going then from that to India and finding that in any given week there were 3 religious festivals of completely different religions, all of which would stop work for, the whole of India would close down. That in itself was a lesson.
Yeah, I think it's very hard in India to book all the religious holidays and get everything together there. Do you think, gentlemen, that our sense of purpose or idea of purpose interacts with our moralities in our daily lives? Does it shape, maybe our political or other views as well, like how we think about, gun control, how we think about, racism, all that?
Well, again, let me I think, it reverts back to the business of knowing yourself. So, some people can be quite happy behaving in an immoral way, and some people can't. It's a question of individual choice. Although, I think both William and I would agree that it's important to do what you love and to try and chase that. A lot of life does involve a bit of drudgery and getting up at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning to do something you don't particularly like because you have to pay the bills, and there are responsibilities. The great thing generally about being 19 or 20 and a student is that you don't have, generally speaking, much in the way of responsibilities, but as you get older, unless you're very unusual, you will have children or elderly relatives you have to look after. And that's an important duty, a dharma, that it's very hard to avoid. So it's again, I suppose it's a question of balance, that try and do the things that you enjoy and give you pleasure, but you'll have to work very hard at it.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that point, that it's great to be able to follow your dreams, but that's a relatively recent innovation throughout the scope of human history. So for most of human history, people have not had the opportunities to follow their dreams, to follow their passions. And again, it's great if you're able to do that.
Don Quixote did.
Yes, that's true.
Look where it got him.
But it can also be taken to extremes, too, this sort of like individualism. So it's like, I'm going to divorce my spouse because it's just not consistent with my dreams or my personal well-being. But then what does that do to the family unit, to the children that are left behind? So throughout most of human history, people have had certain roles that they've been responsible to fulfill. And in the context of fulfilling those roles, they have also found a sense of purpose and meaning in life. So there definitely is a balance there, and it's important to acknowledge that balance, and why by persevering through some of the difficult times, people can find purpose and meaning at the end after they get over the difficult times.
Yes, and I think we can also establish that our purpose is not eternal. It evolves as we evolve, right?
Well, it depends. I mean, if you believe in a religion, you do believe the purpose is eternal. That's the great advantage of religion, that it comes, as it were, pre-packaged with answers for you. And if you like Camus and Sartre and other people, you don't see a supreme deity, a great celestial scheme. It makes your life harder.
David, have you perceived any differences between the US and maybe Europe in this regard? How we think about our purpose? Are one or the other maybe more religious, more secular, or just a different world altogether?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the United States has a reputation of being the most religious country within the Western tradition. And I think that's true at maybe the popular level, so at the level of the middle class and the working class. But amongst the elites in America, they are extremely secular and probably parallel what we would see in much of Europe. I do think that here in Hungary, there's much more of an emphasis upon traditional values. So I know that I feel safe walking around any section of Budapest that I've been to, whereas I wouldn't say that I feel safe in a lot of cities in America.
I mean, I think it's true that religion is out of fashion with the the intellectual elites in Europe. I mean, Christianity is almost something to sort of be embarrassed about. Probably in London, if you hang out in Islington and places like that. So maybe it'll change. But let's not forget. I mean, America was founded by people who had very strong religious ideas. That was the whole point of going there. So it's not surprising that that tradition has survived in the US.
Again, I think Europe is the exception here. If you look at the rest of the world, you don't have the death of God in the way you do in most of Europe. You go to India, there's no question religiosity is growing. That there are traditions that I've written about, obscure forms of Hindu festivities, for example, that I wrote was going to be dying out 30 years ago. That are now huge with big festivals and posters for their annual celebrations. Revival, obviously, of religion in Russia. A modest but real revival of Buddhism in China. Huge rise of evangelical Christianity in Africa. Huge rise of Christianity of all sorts in Latin America. And still a strong rearguard from conservative America. So I think the interesting thing is that Europe is the exception. It's not the future of the world necessarily at all. We've always kind of taken the European model as what's happening, what's going to happen everywhere else next. But in terms of religion, there's absolutely no reason to believe that's true.
Well, I should add, I mean, although Christianity is sort of out of fashion, Buddhism, Sufism, all sorts of other things.
Rumi memes on Twitter
are growing. It's acceptable, to be a Buddhist. In fact, it sort of seems, I think, quite cool in London to be a Buddhist. Whereas, going to, Vespers or
the old lady at Evensong from George Orwell's essay.
So I just want to echo that point. Yeah, you take a look at the data across the world, and most people believe in God or the transcendent, some sort of supernatural reality. So that's definitely the case for most of the world's population. The trouble is that America and Western Europe have an outside influence on popular culture around the world.
Again, I'm not sure that's true anymore. I mean, it was certainly true throughout the 1970s and 80s and the end of the last century. But if you look at the big international soap operas that are really doing well, they're Turkish. I mean, and there are Chinese.
There's competition now, yeah.
And that is definitely changing, and that has been a thing of this millennium, that the world dominated by European and American forms of entertainment, particularly American, is passing away to a world where Turkish, Indian Bollywood is vast with huge areas of. I mean, it's not to my taste, but even though I've lived there as long as I have, but it's go all over the Arab world and you find
Nigeria,
the whole of Africa.
The fastest growing YouTube channels right now are all Indian. So the music companies, the Bollywood channels, as you said, yeah. So gentlemen, as we are coming to the end of our talk, I would like to just ask one last question of you, which might be the most difficult that we had today. If you had to say in one word, or maybe a short phrase, what do you think the purpose of life is?
Easy one. Go on, Tibor.
Fun.
One word.
Maybe a short phrase.
To know God and to glorify Him.
The nicest answer I've heard that, I heard Toni Morrison on stage at the Hay Literary Festival just before she died. She was an old lady, had won the Nobel Prize long before, and this was right at the end of her life, in a wheelchair. And she was asked a question like that. And I just read her answer, which I wrote down at the time, and it's very beautiful, it's very short. She said, "We will all be judged on how well we loved." That's it. That's all that matters. How well we loved.
On that note, I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and thank you all as well for listening to us. Thank you, gentlemen.